The gavel came down like a gunshot, and Judge Harlan Peake's voice sliced through the autumn air of Dustfield's courthouse square with the precision of a man who enjoyed his authority. Margaret Callaway, widow, debtor, 3 dependents, outstanding debts of $169. He paused, letting his eyes travel over Maggie where she stood on the courthouse steps, the way a man appraised livestock he'd already decided wasn't worth the feed. The morning sun was merciless, illuminating every extra pound on her frame, every patch on her dress, every visible sign of her failure to be the kind of woman this town found acceptable. "Any takers, gentlemen?" The laughter started somewhere near the hardware store and spread like wildfire through the gathered crowd. Maggie Callaway did not look down. She had buried her husband Gerald 3 months ago with the last of her tears, and she'd be damned if she'd give this town a single thing more. She fixed her eyes on a point above Peake's left shoulder and breathed through her nose, keeping her shoulders square despite the weight of humiliation pressing down on them. Behind her, she felt Thomas's small fists twisted in the back of her coat. Rose pressed against her left leg, trembling. Clara stood rigid on her right, 14 years old and already carrying the weight of someone twice her age. "Lord have mercy," a woman's voice carried from the crowd, sharp with false piety. "3 children and that figure. Who in God's name would take that on?" "Might need 2 men just to manage the woman alone," a man's voice, followed by another wave of cruel laughter. Maggie's jaw tightened, but she did not move. She had survived her parents' deaths, her husband's failures, and a mountain of debt that had grown while Gerald chased dreams that never materialized. She would survive this too. "The court is prepared to be generous," Peake continued, leaning forward with the showman's pause of a man who lived for moments like these. "Any man willing to assume the Callaway debts receives full claim to the widow's domestic labor and reasonable labor from the older children." He let that settle. "Or, if a man of sufficient means wished to make the arrangement permanent, well, Reverend Cole's church is right across the street." More laughter, cruder this time. Nobody stepped forward. The crowd shuffled and glanced at each other, but $169 was real money, and Maggie Callaway was a large woman with 3 mouths attached to her. Entertainment value aside, nobody actually wanted to be the man who took her home. "In the event no suitable arrangement is reached," Peake said, consulting his papers with casual indifference, "the court would transfer the 3 Callaway minors to the county children's home in Denver, pending—" "No!" The word came out of Maggie before she could stop it. Not loud, not theatrical, just flat and absolute, the way a door sounded when it closed on something that would never reopen. Peake looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "You don't have standing to object, Mrs. Callaway." "I am their mother," Maggie said, her voice carrying across the square with unexpected force. "I have all the standing there is." That was when the crowd shifted. Maggie felt it before she saw it, a ripple moving through the gathered bodies like a current through still water. People stepped aside, not quickly but steadily, the way people moved when something large and deliberate was coming through. A man emerged from the crowd, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a gray felt hat worn at the brim, and buckskin that marked him as someone who lived outside the boundaries of polite society. His dark hair fell past his collar, and his beard was full and untrimmed. But his eyes, those winter-gray eyes, held something that made even Judge Peake straighten slightly in his seat. The man walked to the base of the courthouse steps and stopped. He looked up at Maggie, not at Peek, not at the crowd, at her. The way her father had once looked at problems worth solving, with complete attention and no drama whatsoever. "I'll take them," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried the kind of certainty that didn't need volume to be heard. The courthouse square went quiet enough that Maggie heard a horse stamp its foot 2 streets over. Peek leaned forward. "I'm sorry?" "The Callaways," the man said. "The woman and her 3 children. I'll assume the debts." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I've got the deed to Wheeler Creek Ranch. 400 acres, clean title, no liens. You want additional surety? Name it." Something changed in the air. Maggie stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, while this stranger offered to buy her family's freedom like it was the most natural thing in the world. Peek stared at him. "Elijah Wheeler, you're serious?" "I don't generally come to town to joke, Harlan." And in that moment, standing on those courthouse steps with her children pressed against her, and a stranger looking up at her with eyes that saw something the rest of the town had missed, Maggie Callaway felt the first crack appear in the wall of despair she'd been living behind. If you're already wondering whether Elijah Wheeler is Maggie's salvation, or something far more complicated, then you're exactly who I made this story for. Grab yourself some coffee, settle in, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's continue. Elijah Wheeler didn't wait for Peek's formal approval. He simply walked up the courthouse steps, removed his hat, and said to Maggie, "Ma'am." That single word of plain courtesy, nothing more than what he'd offer any woman on any ordinary afternoon, hit Maggie somewhere behind her sternum with unexpected force. She'd been standing there braced for mockery or pity, and instead received simple human decency. "Margaret Callaway," she managed. "Elijah Wheeler." His eyes moved past her to the children, taking them in with quiet assessment. "That's your whole outfit?" "That's all of us." He nodded once, the way a man nodded when he'd made a decision and was done reconsidering it. "Wagon's on the east side of the square. Take whatever time you need." He turned and walked back down the steps, the crowd parting for him the same way it had before. Maggie stood there for one more heartbeat, looking out at every face that had laughed at her. Ida Mercer in her fine coat, the men near the hardware store, Judge Peek with his gavel still raised. She didn't say a word to any of them. She simply took Rose's hand and said, "Come on now," and walked her family down those steps without looking back. The wagon was exactly where he'd said it would be. 2 sturdy horses, supplies already loaded, everything practical and well-maintained. Elijah was checking a harness strap when they arrived. "Let me help you up," he said, coming around to Maggie's side. "I can manage." He looked at her, something shifting in his expression. Not impatience, but careful recalibration. "I expect you can manage most things. I'm asking anyway. It's a high step." It was a high step. She looked at his offered hand and thought about 3 months of managing everything alone, of how that kind of managing ground you down in ways that had nothing to do with the weight you were carrying. She put her hand in his. He helped her up without visible effort, without any change in his expression that suggested her size was something worth noting. Then he lifted Rose up with the same careful efficiency, offered Thomas a hand that the boy ignored on principle, and waited while Clara climbed up herself with silent dignity. Nobody spoke for the first mile out of town. The October sky stretched overhead, that particular violent blue that Colorado did in autumn. The wagon wheels made their steady sound on the packed earth, and Maggie sat with her hands folded in her lap, trying to understand what had just happened to her life. "Mister?" Thomas's voice broke the silence from the wagon bed, trying to sound older than 11. "You got a ranch?" "Wheeler Creek, west of town, about 8 miles. Cattle, some horses mainly." "I know horses," Thomas said, laying down his credentials. "My father kept 2 before he passed. I can work." "I imagine so." Elijah glanced sideways at Maggie, and she saw him deciding how to handle this. "You're 11? "Yes, sir." "Where I come from, 11's old enough to work and young enough to still learn, both at the same time. That sit all right with you?" Thomas considered this, looking for condescension and not finding any. "I reckon." Rose had been studying Elijah with the focused attention she usually reserved for insects and interesting rocks. "Do you have any kids?" "Rose!" Maggie said sharply. "I'm just asking." "No," Elijah said. "Never did." "Why not?" "That is enough," Maggie said firmly. But something in Elijah's expression had already shifted. Some old pain surfacing briefly before being pushed back down. Clara had been silent the entire time, watching everything with those careful eyes of hers. Now she spoke, her voice quiet but deliberate. "You could have picked someone easier. There were other women up there this morning, younger ones without 3 children. She paused. "I want to know why you picked us specifically." Elijah didn't turn around, but Maggie saw the line of his shoulders change. "I heard what you said to the judge," he said to the road ahead. "When he mentioned Denver, the way you said no." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother said no like that once, to a man trying to take something from her that wasn't his to take. She didn't win, but she said it anyway. I never forgot what it sounded like." The wagon was very quiet. "What happened to her?" Clara asked. "She died when I was 14. The man she'd said no to owned the bank. Made sure we lost everything after." His hands tightened briefly on the reins. "I learned earlier that sometimes the people with power use it to crush those without it. And I learned I wanted no part of that." Maggie looked at his profile, this stranger who'd just paid $169 to buy her family's freedom, and felt something shift in her chest. Some calcification of grief and caution developing its first hairline crack. "They call prejudice many things," the narrator's voice might have observed here. "They call it tradition, or standards, or simply the way things are. But strip away the language, and what remains is always the same. The strong deciding that the weak deserve their weakness. The comfortable deciding that the struggling deserve their struggle. And every so often, someone comes along who remembers what it felt like to be crushed, and decides they will not be the one doing the crushing. Those are the ones worth watching. Those are the ones who change the shape of the world, one small act of defiance at a time." The Wheeler Creek Ranch came into view around a long bend. Substantial log house, large barn, the kind of place built by someone who understood that this land didn't forgive carelessness. Maggie saw it with practical eyes first, the way she saw everything now. The bones were good. She'd lived in enough houses to know which ones could be made into homes. Elijah set the brake and came around to help her down. This time she accepted without protest, and his hand on her elbow was steady and sure. "Welcome to Wheeler Creek," he said simply. And for the first time in 3 months, Maggie Callaway allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place to land. The house smelled of wood smoke and leather and something faintly sweet, dried apples hanging from a rafter in the kitchen. The floors were swept clean, the tables scarred but solid. 2 windows looked out toward mountains that were beginning to catch the afternoon light, throwing gold across the floorboards. Maggie stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the iron stove. It was a good stove, heavy and wide, the kind that would heat the whole room in winter and hold a temperature steady. She crossed to it without thinking, ran her hands along the surface, checking the flue, testing the damper, reading it the way she'd read any tool she was about to use. "Good stove," she said. "Came from St. Louis," Elijah said from the doorway. "Cost more than I care to remember." "Worth it," she straightened, already cataloging what needed doing. "I'll need to know what you have in the pantry." "Left-hand door." She opened it and looked at what was there. Flour, beans, salt pork, dried apples, coffee. The inventory of a man living alone. She began the calculation she'd been doing her whole adult life. What was here? What was needed? What could be made from the distance between those 2 things? "Mr. Wheeler," she said, not turning from the pantry. "Elijah?" "Elijah." She said it more easily this time. "You'll sleep in the house, not the barn." "I said the barn would be—" "I heard what you said." She turned to face him. "I've got 2 daughters in this house. What the town thinks of me is one thing. What my girls learn from how a man conducts himself under his own roof is another. You'll sleep in your own room. That's not negotiable." He looked at her for a moment, something that might become respect moving through his expression. "All right." The first few days, they circled each other like wary animals sharing territory. Elijah rose before dawn to tend the animals, coming in only when the coffee was already made, because Maggie had been up even earlier. She took over the kitchen with quiet efficiency, organizing shelves, mending his torn shirts with neat, precise stitches that spoke of years of practice. Thomas shadowed Elijah like a determined ghost, soaking up everything about horses and cattle and the rhythms of ranch work. Rose collected stones along the creek and arranged them in careful patterns on her windowsill. Clara watched everything with those assessing eyes, reserving judgment. They spoke only when necessary, sharing space, but not yet sharing anything deeper. The silence between them was the silence of 2 people who'd been hurt enough to be cautious, who understood that trust was earned slowly or not at all. Then came the afternoon when everything changed. Maggie had been working in the overgrown garden behind the house, pulling weeds from beds that had gone wild. The October sun was warm on her back, and she was so focused on the work that she didn't notice the warning signs. The dizziness came first, then the spots in her vision, and suddenly the ground was rushing up to meet her. She felt herself falling, felt the sickening lurch of gravity taking over. Then strong hands caught her, breaking her fall, and she was being lifted with surprising ease. Elijah carried her to the porch and set her carefully in the chair there, his face tight with concern. "When did you last eat?" His voice was sharp. Breakfast, I think." "That was 8 hours ago. And you drank water?" She couldn't remember. He disappeared into the house and returned with a cup of cold water and a piece of cornbread left from lunch. "Drink, slowly." She obeyed, embarrassed by her weakness, by needing to be rescued like some fragile thing. "I'm sorry. I'm not usually—" "Maggie." He crouched in front of her so their eyes were level, and the intensity in his gaze stopped her mid-sentence. "You've been up before dawn every day for a week. You've been working as hard as any ranch hand I've ever hired. At altitude your body isn't used to yet. That's not fragility. That's stubbornness." "I don't want to be useless." "Useless?" His eyebrows rose. "In 1 week, you've organized my entire supply system, mended every piece of clothing I own, cooked meals that made me remember what real food tastes like, and started rehabilitating a garden I'd given up on." He paused. "If that's your version of useless, I'd hate to see what you consider productive." Tears pricked Maggie's eyes, hot and unexpected. She'd spent so long believing the narrative that her body made her worthless, that anything she contributed was overshadowed by the sin of taking up space. Hearing Elijah list her accomplishments like they mattered, like she mattered, broke something loose inside her. "Why are you crying?" He sounded genuinely panicked now. "Did I say something wrong?" "No. You said everything right." She wiped at her eyes angrily. "That's the problem. I'm not used to being appreciated. It makes me feel things I shouldn't feel." "What kind of things?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Maggie looked into his winter-gray eyes and felt the careful walls she'd built around her heart begin to crumble. "Things that complicate a business arrangement," she whispered. Elijah's hand rose slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her cheek with a gentleness that stole her breath. His palm was rough with calluses, warm from the sun, and his thumb brushed away a stray tear. "What if I told you I've been feeling those complicated things too?" His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "That having you here has been the best thing to happen to me in 5 years. That I wake up looking forward to the day because you're in it." "I'd say you're talking crazy. That men don't feel that way about women like me." "Then maybe I am crazy." His thumb traced along her cheekbone, the touch achingly tender. "But Maggie, when I look at you, I don't see what those cruel people in town see. I see strength, courage, kindness that survived despite every reason to turn bitter. I see a woman who makes my coffee taste better just by sitting across the table from me." "Elijah." She didn't know what to say, how to process the enormity of what he was offering. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know that you're not alone in feeling complicated things." He stood, giving her space, but paused at the door. "And for what it's worth, Maggie, I think you're beautiful. Not despite anything, but because of everything you are." Then he was gone, leaving Maggie alone on the porch with her hand pressed to the cheek he'd touched, her heart hammering a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like hope. That night, she lay awake in the small room he'd given her, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the not knowing what came next didn't feel like standing at the edge of a cliff. It felt like standing at the beginning of something she hadn't been given the map for yet, but wanted to explore anyway. In the darkness, she pressed her fingers to her lips and allowed herself to smile. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and deeply right. Maggie woke each morning to the sound of Elijah moving quietly around the cabin, starting the fire, putting coffee on to boil. She would emerge from her room to find him already at work, and they would share that first cup in comfortable silence, watching the dawn paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. But now the silence was different. Now it hummed with things unsaid, with glances that lingered a moment too long, with the careful dance of two people learning each other's rhythms while trying not to want too much too fast. Thomas had attached himself to Elijah with the determination of a boy who'd found something he'd been missing without knowing he was looking for it. They worked together in the barn, Elijah teaching Thomas how to read a horse's mood, how to check hooves for stones, how to gentle a nervous animal with nothing but patience and a steady hand. One afternoon, Maggie watched from the kitchen window as Thomas struggled to lead a stubborn mare into her stall. The horse balked, tossing her head, and Thomas's frustration was visible in every line of his small body. Elijah said something Maggie couldn't hear, and Thomas stopped pulling. Instead, he stood still, his hand on the mare's neck, waiting. After a long moment, the mare lowered her head and walked into the stall as if it had been her idea all along. When Thomas came in for supper that night, his face was glowing. "Did you see, Mama? She came to me. Elijah says the secret is making them think it's their choice." "Elijah's right," Maggie said, ladling stew into his bowl. "That's true about horses and about people." Thomas looked at her with those serious eyes that sometimes seemed far too old for his face. "I like it here, Mama. I like him." "I know, sweetheart. Do you like him too?" Maggie set down the ladle and looked at her son. "Yes, I do." Thomas nodded, satisfied, and dove into his stew. And Maggie felt another piece of the wall around her heart crumble away. Clara took longer to thaw. She watched Elijah with the wariness of someone who'd seen too many men make promises they didn't keep, who'd learned that protection could turn to control in a heartbeat. But Elijah seemed to understand this instinctively. He never pushed, never demanded her trust. He simply showed up, day after day, consistent and steady. The breakthrough came on a quiet evening when Clara was at the kitchen table, struggling with a book on territorial law she'd found on Elijah's shelf. She'd been frowning at the same page for 20 minutes, her frustration building visibly. "That section's poorly written," Elijah said, coming to stand behind her chair. He didn't touch her, didn't reach for the book. "The author uses too many words to say simple things." Clara looked up, surprised. "You've read this?" "Cover to cover. Needed to understand water rights when I filed for this land." He paused. "If you want, I could explain that section in plain language." Clara looked at him for a long moment, weighing something. Then she slid the book toward him. "All right." Maggie watched from the stove as Elijah sat down across from Clara and began to explain, his voice patient, his manner respectful. He treated her like someone whose mind was worth engaging, not like a child to be patronized. And slowly, Clara's rigid shoulders began to relax. Later that night, when the children were in bed, Clara stopped by Maggie's room. "Mama?" "Yes, sweetheart?" "I think we can stay here. I think it's safe." Coming from Clara, who trusted no one and nothing easily, it was the highest possible endorsement. Maggie pulled her daughter into her arms and held her tight, feeling the last of her own resistance crumble away. Rose, predictably, had no such reservations. She declared Elijah interesting on the second day and proceeded to treat him like a particularly large and useful piece of furniture. She showed him her rock collection with great solemnity, explaining the difference between creek stones and mountain stones with the authority of a professor. She asked him approximately 300 questions about everything from why horses had big eyes to whether he thought clouds had feelings. And Elijah, this taciturn rancher who lived alone by choice, answered every single question with the same grave attention he gave to everything else. "Do you like having us here?" Rose asked him one morning at breakfast, with the blunt directness of a 9-year-old who hadn't learned that some questions weren't supposed to be asked. Elijah looked at her seriously. "Yes, I do." "Why?" "Because this house feels like a home now, instead of just a place to sleep." Rose nodded, satisfied. "Good. I like being home." The word hung in the air. Home. Maggie felt it settle into her chest, warm and solid and terrifying in its permanence. As the weeks passed, Maggie found herself blooming in ways she hadn't expected. She expanded the garden, planning for spring planting. She reorganized the entire house, not because Elijah asked her to, but because she wanted to leave her mark on it, wanted to transform his space into their space. She cooked elaborate meals just for the pleasure of watching him enjoy them, of seeing Thomas ask for seconds, of hearing Rose declare something, "the best thing ever." And Elijah watched her with those winter-gray eyes, always careful, always respectful, but with a heat building behind them that she recognized because she felt it too. The evening everything changed began ordinarily enough. Supper was done, the children were occupied with their own pursuits, and Maggie was washing dishes when Elijah came to stand beside her with a drying cloth. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know." He picked up a plate and began drying it with careful attention. They worked in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the splash of water and the clink of dishes. "Maggie," he said finally, not looking at her, "I need to tell you something." Her heart kicked against her ribs. "All right." "That day at the courthouse, when I offered to take you and your children, it wasn't entirely altruistic." He set down the plate and turned to face her. "I told myself it was about doing what's right, about standing up to Peak and those cruel people, and that was part of it. But the truth is, I'd seen you before." "What?" "3 months ago, at your husband's funeral. I was at the back of the church." His voice was low, almost ashamed. "I saw you standing there with your children, holding yourself together when everything was falling apart. I saw the way you comforted them, even though you were drowning yourself. And He stopped, swallowed hard. "I couldn't stop thinking about you, about that kind of strength." Maggie's hands had gone still in a dishwater. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I'm a man who lives alone on a mountain. Because I had nothing to offer. Because I didn't think you'd want anything to do with me, even if I did." He met her eyes, finally. "But when I saw you on those courthouse steps, when I heard you say no to Peak with that same fierce strength I'd seen at the funeral, I knew I couldn't walk away. Even if all I could offer was shelter and work, I had to offer something." "Elijah." She pulled her hands from the water, dried them on her apron. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know that this was never just about charity or doing the right thing. From the beginning, it was about you. About wanting you in my life, even if I didn't know how to say it. Maggie looked at this man who'd bought her freedom, who'd given her children safety, who'd treated her with more respect in 6 weeks than she'd received in years. This man who was looking at her now with his heart in his eyes, vulnerable in a way she suspected he rarely allowed himself to be. She stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palm. "I'm glad you were there that day. I'm glad you saw me. I'm glad you came." His hand covered hers, holding it against his heart. "Maggie, I'm falling in love with you. I might already be there. And I know it's too soon. I know you might not feel." She rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was brief, chaste even, just a press of her lips against his, but it was deliberate and clear and said everything she didn't have words for yet. When she pulled back, his eyes were wide with wonder. "I'm falling too," she whispered, "and it terrifies me. But I'm done being afraid of things that feel right." He cupped her face in both hands, his calloused thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "We'll go slow. As slow as you need." "No." She held his gaze. "I've spent my whole life going slow, being careful, protecting myself from hurt. For once, I want to be reckless. I want to feel everything." When he kissed her this time, it was not chaste or brief. It was deep and thorough and full of weeks of wanting held carefully in check. It was a promise and a question and an answer all at once. And when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Maggie felt as though she'd stepped off a cliff and discovered she could fly. From the doorway, they heard a small, satisfied sound. They turned to find Rose standing there with a knowing smile. "I knew it," she announced triumphantly. "Clara owes me her blue ribbon." "Rose," Maggie said, her cheeks flaming. "Go to bed." I'm going." She paused at the doorway to her room. "But for the record, I approve. He's much better than Papa was." She disappeared, leaving Maggie and Elijah staring at each other in shock before they both dissolved into helpless laughter. "Out of the mouths of babes," Elijah said, pulling Maggie back into his arms. "She's not wrong," Maggie admitted against his chest. "Gerald was many things, but careful and steady weren't among them." "I'm both of those things to a fault." "I know." She looked up at him. "That's exactly what I need." They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other while the lamp burned low and the children slept and the mountains kept their ancient watch over Wheeler Creek Ranch. And for the first time in her adult life, Maggie Callaway allowed herself to believe that happiness wasn't something she had to earn or prove herself worthy of. It was something she could simply accept, with open hands and an open heart. 3 weeks of careful happiness passed before the shadow found them. 3 weeks of morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, of Elijah teaching Thomas to rope fence posts, of Clara reading aloud from law books while Elijah listened with genuine interest, of Rose declaring herself the ranch's official rock inspector. 3 weeks of stolen kisses in the barn, of Elijah's hand finding Maggie's under the table at supper, of falling asleep with a smile on her face. 3 weeks before the letter arrived. It came on a Thursday morning, delivered by a rider from town. Maggie was kneading bread when she heard the horse, and something in the sound of it, something urgent and wrong, made her wipe the flour from her hands and step onto the porch. The rider was young, barely out of boyhood, and he looked uncomfortable as he handed Elijah a sealed envelope. "From the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company, sir. Man at the post office said it was urgent." Elijah took the envelope, his face unreadable. He waited until the boy had ridden away before he opened it, and Maggie watched his expression darken with each line he read. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Trouble always came in envelopes with official seals. He handed her the letter without a word. Maggie read it twice, her heart sinking with each pass. The railroad claimed prior rights to Wheeler Creek's water, citing a territorial grant from 1861 that supposedly predated Elijah's own filing by 8 years. They gave him 30 days to respond, or the claim would be considered uncontested. 30 days to prove his right to the water that made his ranch possible, or lose everything. "This is the third rancher they've gone after this year," Elijah said, his voice tight. "Tom Henderson gave up last month, signed over his water rights for $200 and a promise they wouldn't take his land." "That's not a settlement," Maggie said. "That's robbery with a receipt." She read the letter again, her father's training kicking in automatically. He'd taught her to read contracts, to understand the language of law and land and power. This grant they're citing, 1,142 from April 1861. That's before Colorado was even a proper territory. Which means it's either real and we're in trouble, or it's manufactured and we have to prove it. Or, Clara's voice came from the doorway, making them both turn, it's real, but doesn't mean what they're saying it means. Clara came onto the porch, her face serious in that way that made her look far older than 14. Land grants from that period were very specific about what they covered. A grant for railroad right-of-way isn't the same as a grant for water rights. They're separate filings. Maggie stared at her daughter. "How do you know that?" "Grandfather's books, the ones about territorial law." She looked almost apologetic. "I read them when I was 12 because there wasn't anything else on the shelf I hadn't finished." Elijah looked between mother and daughter with something like awe. "You're saying the grant might be real, but it might not cover what they claim it covers." "That's exactly what I'm saying. And the only way to know is to read the original." Clara crossed her arms. "Someone needs to go to Denver and pull the document from the Territorial Land Office." But that would take time they didn't have, and money that was already tight. Maggie's mind raced through possibilities, through the resources they had and the resources they needed. Then she remembered something Dorothy Haynes, the seamstress in town, had said weeks ago. Something about old families and older agreements. "I need to go to town," Maggie said. "There might be another way." The visit to Dorothy Haynes's shop revealed more than Maggie had dared hope. Dorothy, who'd lived in Dustfield for 40 years and knew everyone's history, told her about Carita Reyes, a woman in her 70s whose family had lived in the valley since before it was American territory. The Reyes family had water-sharing agreements with 3 other families going back to 1847, Dorothy said, her needle never stopping its precise work. Agreements that were witnessed and honored long before any territorial grant existed. The railroads counting on nobody remembering, or nobody caring about agreements that weren't filed with the government. "Would Carita talk to me?" Maggie asked. "She might, if you go respectfully and don't pretend the history means less than it does." Dorothy looked at Maggie over her spectacles. "She doesn't like the railroad. They took her family's water 2 years ago for almost nothing because they didn't know they had a choice." Maggie rode out to the East Ridge the next morning. Elijah beside her, despite her protests that Carita might not speak freely with a white rancher present. "Then I'll wait outside," he'd said simply. "But I'm not letting you ride that far alone." Carita Reyes sat on her porch in a straight-backed chair, watching them approach with dark eyes that missed nothing. She had white hair and brown hands, and the bearing of someone who'd survived enough that the present rarely alarmed her. Elijah stayed with the horses as promised. Maggie walked to the porch alone. "Mrs. Reyes, my name is Margaret Wheeler. I've come to ask for your help." They talked for over an hour. Carita spoke slowly, precisely, of the creek and how it ran, of the families who'd used it, of agreements made before any territorial official had ever set foot in the valley. Then she disappeared into her house and returned with a cedar box. Inside were documents in 3 languages, some barely legible, some in handwriting so precise it looked like engraving. And there, among letters and maps and fading photographs, Maggie found gold. A handwritten note, dated 1862, signed by Josiah Pratt, railroad site supervisor, stating explicitly that Grant 1142 covered only the rail bed and right-of-way and excluded existing water agreements. "The railroad's own man," Maggie breathed. "Their own supervisor saying the grant doesn't cover water rights." Carita smiled, the expression both sad and satisfied. "My grandmother kept everything. She said someday the words would matter." "They matter now." Maggie looked at the older woman. "Would you testify to this, in court? If it means stopping them from doing to others what they did to us, yes." Maggie rode back to the ranch with the documents carefully wrapped in oilcloth, her heart hammering with equal parts hope and fear. They had evidence, real evidence, but they still had to convince Judge Peake, who'd never ruled against the railroad in his life. When she told Elijah what she'd found, he pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "This could work," he said against her hair. "With Cal Morrison as our lawyer and these documents, we might actually win this." "We will win this," Maggie said with a certainty she was still building inside herself. "Because we have the truth, and we have each other, and we're not going to let them take this from us." But that night, as she lay in bed listening to the house settle around her, doubt crept in. The railroad had money, lawyers, influence. They'd crushed families before. What made her think she was any different? Then she felt Elijah's hand slip into hers in the darkness. He'd taken to sleeping on the floor beside her door after the letter came, refusing to leave her unprotected even in their own home. "I can hear you thinking," he whispered. "Stop it." "What if we lose?" "Then we lose together, and we figure out what comes next, together." He squeezed her hand. "But we're not going to lose, Maggie. You're too damn stubborn to let them win." She smiled in the darkness. "Is that your way of calling me difficult?" "That's my way of saying I love you. All of you, including the stubborn parts. Especially the stubborn parts. Love." He'd said it so simply, like it was just a fact, like the sun rising or water running downhill, like it was the easiest thing in the world. "I love you too," she whispered back. "Even though you're reckless and impractical and bought a whole family on a whim." "Best whim I ever had." They lay there in the darkness, hands clasped, while the weight of what was coming pressed down on them both. The railroad wouldn't give up easily. The fight ahead would be public and ugly. But for the first time in her life, Maggie wasn't facing the fight alone. Sometimes, the narrator might have observed, love arrives not as salvation, but as partnership. Not as rescue, but as reinforcement. The most powerful kind of love doesn't carry you through the storm. It stands beside you in it, lending its strength to yours, until together you're strong enough to face whatever comes. This is the love that changes everything, because it doesn't ask you to be less than you are. It asks you to be more, and promises to be more alongside you. 3 days later, the trouble came in person. Maggie was alone at the ranch, the children at their lessons with Elijah teaching them to read track signs in the north pasture, when she heard horses, multiple riders coming fast. She moved to the window and felt her blood go cold. 3 men in the yard. Not lawyers in suits, but the other kind of men the railroad employed. The kind who delivered messages that didn't require words. She grabbed the rifle from above the door and checked that it was loaded with hands that wanted to shake, but didn't. Then she stepped onto the porch and aimed the rifle at the ground, not threatening, but ready. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clear across the yard, "you're on private property." The lead man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Wheeler, we've come with a message from Mr. Burke. He's prepared to offer $500 for your water rights. Final offer. You've got 3 days to accept before we stop being polite about this." "The answer is no. Now leave." "Ma'am, I don't think you understand the situation." Maggie raised the rifle, not pointing it at anyone, just lifting it enough that they could see she knew how to hold it. "I understand perfectly. You're trying to steal land and water from people who can't fight back. You've done it before, and you think you can do it again. But you picked the wrong family this time." "Mrs. Wheeler," I said, "leave." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the lead man shrugged and turned his horse. 3 days, ma'am. Think carefully about what happens after that." They rode out, and Maggie stood on that porch with the rifle in her hands, shaking now that they were gone, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. That's how Elijah found her 20 minutes later, still standing there, the rifle lowered but her hands white-knuckled on the barrel. He didn't ask questions. He simply took the rifle, set it aside, and pulled her into his arms. "You're safe. I've got you." And Maggie, who'd spent her whole life being strong because she had no choice, finally allowed herself to break a little, crying into his chest while he held her steady. "I thought they might hurt you," she sobbed. "Or the children. I thought—" "Shh, we're all safe. You're safe." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. "And you were magnificent." Facing down 3 men with nothing but a rifle and nerve. I was terrified. Being terrified and doing it anyway is the definition of courage, Maggie. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You're the strongest person I've ever known." That night, he didn't sleep on the floor. He climbed into bed beside her, fully clothed, and held her while she shook with the aftermath of fear. And when she finally asked the question that had been eating at her since the men left, he answered without hesitation. "What if they come back? What if they hurt you because of me?" "Then they hurt me. But Maggie, I want you to understand something." He tilted her face up so she had to meet his eyes. "I would rather face down the entire railroad with you beside me than live another day safe and alone. You and those children, you're my family now, and I don't abandon family." She kissed him then, deep and desperate, trying to pour everything she felt into that connection. When they broke apart, she whispered, "Marry me. Really marry me, not just on paper. I want everyone to know I chose you, that we chose each other." "We're already married," he said, but his voice was rough with emotion. "That was a business arrangement to protect us from the court. This would be different. This would be us saying we want this forever, no matter what comes." Elijah looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression cracked open completely. "Yes, God, yes. I'll marry you in front of the whole town if that's what you want. I want exactly that. I want them all to see that the fat widow they mocked found a man who loves her exactly as she is. I want them to see that we're not afraid." "We're terrified," he corrected, "but we're doing it anyway." She smiled against his chest. "I love you, Elijah Wheeler." "I love you too, Maggie Callaway Wheeler. Now sleep. We've got a fight to prepare for." But neither of them slept much that night. They lay tangled together in the darkness, stealing whatever comfort they could from each other's presence, while outside the wind moved through the valley, and Wheeler Creek ran over its stones, and 30 days ticked steadily down toward whatever came next. The hearing took place on a cold November morning, 28 days after the railroad's first letter. The courthouse square was packed with more people than Maggie had ever seen there, ranchers and their families, townspeople who'd grown tired of watching the railroad crush anyone who stood in their way, and a surprising number of women from the church society who'd apparently decided this fight mattered. Maggie stood on the courthouse steps in a new dress Dorothy Haynes had made for her, deep blue wool that fit properly and made her feel, for the first time in years, like she had armor worth wearing. Elijah stood beside her in his best shirt, Clara, Thomas, and Rose slightly behind them, a united front. Inside, Judge Peak sat at his bench, looking uncomfortable with the size of the crowd. He was used to railroad business being conducted quietly, without witnesses. This was something else entirely. Cal Morrison, their lawyer, was a compact man in his 60s who'd spent 40 years practicing small-town law, and who had, as he'd told them privately, been waiting for someone to finally challenge the railroad's theft. He presented their case with methodical precision. First, the deed to Wheeler Creek Ranch and the water rights filing from 1869. Then, the original Grant 1142, pulled from the Denver archives, showing clearly that it covered only railroad right-of-way, not water resources. Then, the Josiah Pratt letter, the railroad's own supervisor stating explicitly that water agreements were excluded from the grant. The railroad's lawyer, Aldous French, was a Denver man in an expensive suit who'd probably never lost a case like this before. He stood and tried to discredit the documents, calling the Pratt letter unverifiable, claiming the water rights filing was improperly executed. That's when Carita Reyes rose from her seat in the second row. "If the court will hear me," she said with the dignity of someone who'd lived through too much to be intimidated by a courtroom, "I'd like to speak to prior established use." Peake hesitated, looking at French. But Dorothy Haynes from the back of the room said clearly, "Let her speak, Judge. We all came to hear the evidence." And around her the crowd made a sound that was agreement and warning both. The sound of people who'd decided they were done being pushed around. Peake nodded reluctantly. "The court will hear the witness." Carita spoke for 15 minutes. She told the history of the valley, of families sharing water long before any American flag flew over Colorado, of agreements honored by handshake and witnessed by neighbors. She produced a photograph, age-spotted and precious, of 4 families standing beside Wheeler Creek in front of a hand-painted sign that read, "Water Sharing Agreement Established 1847. This creek fed our families for 80 years before the railroad decided it belonged to them," she said. "My grandmother made me memorize every detail of those agreements so they couldn't be forgotten, and I'm here to say they existed, they were honored, and they came before any railroad grant." The room was absolutely silent. French tried to argue precedent and technicalities, but his voice had lost its certainty. The evidence was too clear, the history too well documented, the room too full of witnesses. When Peake called a recess, Maggie felt Elijah's hand slip into hers. "We might actually win this," he whispered. "We will win this," she said back, and believed it. But they didn't account for one thing. While Peake was in his chambers, Clayton Burke himself entered the courtroom. The railroad's regional representative, the man who'd been systematically stealing water rights for 3 years. He went straight to Judge Peake's door and knocked. They conferred for 20 minutes while the courtroom buzzed with speculation and anger. When Peake returned, his face was carefully neutral. Maggie's heart sank. She knew that expression. It was the expression of a man who'd been reminded where his loyalties lay. "While the documentation presented today is compelling," Peake began, and Maggie felt the floor drop out from under her, "the court finds that—" "Your Honor." Maggie stood up. The entire courtroom turned to look at her. "May I speak?" "Mrs. Wheeler, this is highly irregular." "So is a judge taking instruction from the party he's supposed to be ruling against," Maggie said clearly. Her voice carried to every corner of the room. "Everyone in this courthouse just watched Mr. Burke go into your chambers. Everyone knows what that means." Peake's face flushed red. "That was a procedural clarification." "That was pressure from a man who's used this courtroom to steal from hard-working families for years," Maggie continued. She wasn't shouting, but her voice had steel in it, the steel her father had taught her never to be ashamed of. "And you're about to rule in his favor, despite evidence that clearly shows the railroad has no legal claim to our water. Not because the law supports them, but because they have power and we don't." "Mrs. Wheeler, I will hold you in contempt." "Then hold me in contempt," Maggie said. "But let it be recorded that on this day, November 15th, 1878, Judge Harlan Peake ruled against clear evidence and established precedent because a railroad man asked him to. Let every person in this room be a witness to that." The courtroom erupted. Tom Henderson was on his feet, shouting his agreement. Dorothy Haynes and the churchwomen were calling out their support. Even some of the men who'd laughed at Maggie on those courthouse steps 2 months ago were nodding, their faces grim. Peake hammered his gavel, but the noise didn't stop. He hammered again, and finally the room quieted enough for him to speak. "The court finds," he said, and his voice was tight with anger, "that the railroad's claim is not supported by the evidence presented. The water rights of Wheeler Creek Ranch and all previously established agreements are upheld. The railroad's petition is denied." The gavel came down. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the courthouse exploded with sound, with cheering and shouting, and Tom Henderson's loud whoop of victory. Maggie stood frozen, unable to quite believe it. They'd won. They'd actually won. Elijah pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet, and she laughed and cried at the same time, while around them the celebration built, and Burke stormed out with fury written across his face, and Judge Peake sat at his bench looking like a man who'd just learned that sometimes the people could push back. True strength, the narrator might have observed, is not about overpowering others. It's about standing firm when everything tells you to bend. It's about speaking truth when silence is safer. It's about believing that justice matters even when justice seems impossible. And sometimes, just sometimes, that kind of strength is enough to change the outcome, to shift the balance, to prove that power isn't always where we think it is. The celebration spilled out of the courthouse and into the street, but Maggie barely registered any of it. She stood on the steps with Elijah's arms around her, her children pressed close, and felt the weight she'd been carrying for months finally lift from her shoulders. Tom Henderson pumped Elijah's hand so hard it looked painful. Dorothy Haynes embraced Maggie with surprising strength for such a small woman. Carita Reyes nodded at her with quiet satisfaction, the nod of one warrior recognizing another. Even some of the people who'd laughed at her that first terrible day on these steps approached now with awkward apologies and congratulations. But Maggie found herself looking past all of them, to where Clayton Burke stood beside his carriage, watching her with cold eyes. He didn't say anything, didn't make any threats. He simply looked at her for a long moment, then climbed into his carriage and left. "He'll try again," she said quietly to Elijah. "Maybe not here, maybe not soon. But men like that don't stop." "Then we'll be ready," Elijah said. "But right now, right this moment, we won. Let yourself feel that." So she did. She let herself feel the victory, the relief, the fierce joy of having stood up to power and walked away intact. She let herself feel proud of what she'd done, of what they'd all done together. Cal Morrison approached, his weathered face split with a smile. "Mrs. Wheeler, that was the finest piece of courtroom work I've seen in 40 years. You turned that hearing around single-handedly." "We all did it together," Maggie said, but she felt warmth spread through her chest at the praise. "Take the compliment," Clara said from beside her, and there was something like pride in her daughter's voice. "You were magnificent, Mama." They rode back to Wheeler Creek as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose. Rose fell asleep against Thomas's shoulder in the wagon bed, exhausted from the drama and excitement. Thomas sat straighter than usual, looking older somehow, as if the day had aged him in ways both good and necessary. Clara was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet, the quiet of someone who'd seen justice done and was filing away the memory for future use. When they arrived at the ranch, Elijah helped Maggie down from the wagon with the tenderness of someone handling something infinitely precious. His hands lingered on her waist, his eyes searching her face in the fading light. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "I don't know," she admitted. "I feel like I should be celebrating, but mostly I just feel tired." "That's the fear leaving," he said. "You've been carrying it for so long, you don't know what it feels like without it yet." He pulled her close, pressing his lips to her forehead. "Give yourself time." They put the children to bed, even Thomas, who protested he wasn't tired, and then stood together on the porch watching the stars emerge one by one over the valley.
"I meant what I said,"
Maggie said into the comfortable silence.
"about marrying you properly. I want to stand in front of this whole town and choose you."
"When?" Elijah's voice was rough with emotion.
"Soon. Next month. I don't want to wait any more."
She turned to face him, placing her hands on his chest.
"I've spent my whole life waiting for permission to want things, to have things, to be happy. I'm done waiting."
He cupped her face in both hands, his calloused thumbs tracing her cheekbones with infinite gentleness. "Then we'll do it next month. We'll have the biggest, loudest, most defiant wedding this town has ever seen." She laughed, the sound free and unguarded.
"I don't need biggest or loudest. I just need real."
"Real I can do." He bent to kiss her, slow and deep. The kiss of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use it. When they broke apart, he pressed his forehead against hers. "I love you, Maggie Callaway. I loved you when you stood on those courthouse steps refusing to be broken. I loved you when you faced down 3 men with a rifle. I loved you when you stood up in that courtroom and called out a corrupt judge. And I'll love you every day after this one, for as long as I'm breathing." Tears spilled down Maggie's cheeks, but they were good tears, healing tears.
"I love you too. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever."
"What's that?"
"Hope," she whispered. "The belief that good things could still happen to me. That I deserved good things."
"You deserve everything good," he said fiercely. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know that." They stood there on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, while the night deepened around them. Inside the house, 3 children slept safe and sound. Below them, Wheeler Creek ran clear and free over its stones, water that belonged to them now, legally and finally. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but beautiful nonetheless. Maggie pressed her face into Elijah's chest and breathed in the scent of him, leather and pine smoke, and something uniquely his own. She felt the steady beat of his heart under her cheek, the solid warmth of him, the absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. For the first time since Gerald's death, for the first time since she'd stood on those courthouse steps facing public humiliation, for the first time in years, maybe, Maggie Callaway felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. She felt at peace. "Come inside," she said softly. "It's cold out here." "In a minute." He tightened his arms around her. "I want to hold you under the stars a little longer." So they stood there, 2 people who'd been broken by life and found each other in the breaking, who'd fought for what they had and won against impossible odds, who'd chosen each other not because they had no other options, but because they wanted no other options. And the mountains watched over them as they'd watched over this valley for millennia. And Wheeler Creek sang its quiet song, and inside the house 3 children dreamed of horses and law books and rivers of interesting stones. And on the porch, 2 hearts beat in sync, finding in each other the home they'd both been seeking. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles. The railroad wouldn't give up forever. Winter would come, harsh and testing. Life would continue to be hard in the ways that life in this territory was always hard. But tonight, they had this. They had victory and love and each other. They had a family knitted together by choice rather than blood. They had land and water and a future that was finally, blessedly, theirs. And that was enough. That was everything. Years later, when people in Dustfield told the story of the Wheeler Creek water rights case, they would talk about the day a widow with 3 children stood up to the railroad and won. They would talk about documents and testimony and legal precedent. But those who'd been in that courtroom remembered something else. They remembered a woman who refused to be broken, a man who loved her for exactly who she was, and the moment when ordinary people discovered they had more power than they'd known. That's the story that matters. That's the one worth remembering. And somewhere in the Colorado mountains, a creek still runs clear and free, carrying that memory in every drop of water that flows over its stones, generation after generation, refusing to be stopped, refusing to surrender, flowing on toward whatever comes next with the quiet persistence of all things that truly matter.